will start on October 8th, and that we're taking nominations or
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Well, good afternoon. We'll get started here. It's 4 o'clock. I'm sure there'll be other people walking in, but that's okay. They'll miss the beginning of Bill's talk. I wanted to make two very quick announcements before I do introduction this afternoon. This is the last colloquium presentation for the year. Our next year or next session will start on October 8th at the very beginning of fall term, and we're taking proposals at this point for people or faculty who want to make presentations. So if you've got any ideas that you'd like to speak on, contact either MJ, Heather, contact me, or contact Rory Becker. And we'll probably be putting an announcement out in general for that. Today we have Dr. Bill Grigsby. Bill is a sociologist that comes to that profession in a very sort of unusual way, though forestry has some sociological aspects to it. Both Bill and I share being alumni from the University of Idaho, so in proper light, we're vandals. In other lights, we're just faculty members. He also holds a Ph.D. from Washington State University just across the line, so he must have had some connections between Pullman and Moscow. Yeah. Interestingly enough, I was at the U of I a few weeks ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, and ran into an instructor, purposely looked for an instructor that I had there who was still working, who was Bill's major professor during his master's degree. So that was an interesting connection. His background in international development and the environment, and I love this. I love this statement. Tempered by a morbid fascination with American media and politics. The fascination, unfortunately, has never developed into a desire to serve, and I think his intellect and his balanced attitude would make an exceptional contribution to local politics.
Are you looking for competition for the?
I'm not looking for anything. I'm looking for. I better not say this publicly because we're being streamed. All right, so is written and taught in both of these areas since his arrival at EOU 13 years ago. He likens his time here to describing the moment-by-moment progress at a runway of a runaway train on an abandoned track. Interesting.
Not
Today,
my time here at EOU. That's American
okay.
Media.
Okay,
Yeah.
Got it.
No, EOU's been a real joy. But,
Good. His talk today examines whether there are useful parallels between Americans' consumption of processed foods and processed news and information. Interesting connection. And if so, whether the health of democracy can be sustained without the majority of the electorate even realizing it's sick. Take it away, Bill Grigsby.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for coming. So, I guess, I don't know what you expected. The announcements, all that stuff was maybe a little bit vague. My daughters asked me, well, what are you going to be doing? And I said, well, it'll be sort of like watching TV with me, times 10. And nobody likes watching TV with me at home because I criticize, I analyze the commercials. I'm trying to figure out what kind of formula the programming is using to lure an audience, that kind of thing. So anyway, that's the sort of stuff that that goes around in my head when I consume media. And I've been doing it for a while, and so trying to come up with some themes for a book. And one of them has to do with this idea that there's an issue with the news, and that issue is that, sort of like junk food and processed food, the more processing leads to an unhealthy product for the consumers. And that processing is, in many ways, what we just call propaganda, or another word that I'll explain later, but for lack of a better word, I call it bullshit. Okay, there's a lot of stuff in there that's just sort of like filler. And this is not really a new idea. There have been others who've sort of toyed around with the idea. And so I've got a quote here, maybe, there we go, from Harry Frankfurt, who's this philosopher who's actually written this essay called On Bullshit. And Frankfurt sort of says things that parallel the issues that I want to talk about. One is that there's a lot of bullshit around. Everybody kind of knows that, right? But everybody sort of feels like I can identify it when I see it, not a problem, but nobody has really systematically studied it. And so that was sort of Frankfurt's project. He never really went beyond that, but that's sort of where I feel like I am. I'm not the first to mention that the news diet is increasingly full of filler and non-nutritive sorts of content, but few people go beyond that, that insight that, yeah, there's something here. So I'd really like to take it a step further. You'll notice a lot of these slides will have images and things, and they're not really random. This particular one is this is the Fox News deck. And if you follow Fox News, they came up with this idea, we'll have a deck and it'll be the backdrop. And so you have people working hard at the news with giant computer screens with giant things that they can touch. And they really need like a giant hand they can touch them with, because there's really no reason to have giant screens. So it's a good one for a slide on bullshit, because it's simply a prop, right? It says, we're hard working, look at the big screens we have in the background. It's not, we'll hire more staff, we'll hire more reporters. We'll do some packaging here. So, on Rosemary's advice, the Trinitarian philosophy, I've tried to distill this down to 3 points today. And there are many other points, of course, but they're embedded and they'll come out later, and you'll be confused by the time it's all over, probably. But the first one is that processing is a pretty useful metaphor, clearly for food, but also for information and media. And so if you think, for instance, of stuff we put into our bodies, fast food. If you're a fast food consumer, you probably don't think too much about what's in it as you're consuming it. It's easier to consume that way, usually tastes pretty good, but a lot of the flavor comes by way of chemicals, and a lot of that comes by way of the flavor industry, which is sort of located along the New Jersey Turnpike. And but most people are none the wiser. If you look at the ingredients, you begin to see there are a lot of chemicals, preservatives, other things in it. Most of us don't do that. And when we watch TV, most of us don't think, oh, that image has probably undergone a great deal of processing before it reached my eyeballs and my brain. But that's one of the points I'd like to make today. It has undergone a lot of processing. We're oftentimes none the wiser for it, though. And this processing has a lot to do with propaganda. And to be real basic in terms of propaganda, I'll just define it as mass persuasion. Now, when people write about propaganda, it's influence, right? So you can go to like the timeshare condo weekend, and you get your free weekend at the condo, but then you have to sit through the sales pitch, right? These techniques can work one-on-one as well, and good salespeople understand this really well. If you've had telemarketers on the phone, you understand it. But propaganda is really about persuading the masses, too. And the fact of all this processing really probably leads to ill or poorly defined consequences for our democracy. So in doing something this broad, obviously I've had to make some choices. So one of the first is that I'm sticking with the commercial news model. And it really is the prevailing model in the United States. We don't really fund much in the way of public media. There are plenty of non-commercial, non-profit news sites out there. Their audiences are really small. So my guess is a lot of people in the room here maybe try to steer clear of the interstate highway system of news media, which is good. I commend that. But in terms of the society, we're still influenced by those people who think, well, I got home, I'm tired, I got half an hour, I'll watch the news. And it's sort of laid out for you. So, and that model of commercial media is really dependent on advertising for its revenue. Television is still the main way that most Americans who consume news get their news. The internet, web media are increasing. Print media is on the decline. A lot of people are getting it through social media. This is partly a generational thing, but once again, TV has an influence beyond simply the audience that consumes it. And it's great that we can have elections that get us, good mayors and things like that locally. I'm not talking about local politics so much. I'm talking about national level politics where there's a great deal of money and the stakes are very high. So congressional elections, presidential elections every 4 years or 2 years. And these are just some of the key sources. So I think Teresa was good enough to put up a bunch of sources related to this. If you're interested, any of these would be pretty provocative and interesting to read. The causal logic I'm still working on, as you can see. But, here we go. Okay. So this is something that's been going on for a long time, corporate concentration of ownership. And we come into this discussion having really seen fewer and fewer owners of larger and larger media organizations. I think what's the latest merger I heard was Charter's attempting to purchase Time Warner Cable. And these kinds of things happen all the time, create larger companies, and what they always say is, well, this will allow us to provide a better service for consumers. And we all know that to be true, right? Right. Because corporations wouldn't lie about something like that. When it comes to news, though, we're talking about really a shrinking audience. There are plenty of people who don't really consume very much in the way of news. That doesn't mean they're not affected by what happens in the way news gets presented. But what it does mean is there's pressure to bring an audience because of that commercial news model. So if you want to make money, you got to have an audience, because otherwise advertisers, they don't really care. They want eyeballs. They want to know that the people who are watching are people they can sell products to. More processing of news and information happens in this case. That implies some expense as well, but it also implies that there's less being done in the way of informing and probably more being done in the way of how do we get that audience here. So all of a sudden, let's say a commitment to journalism begins to compete with a need to produce an audience. So, I really want to say this because I don't mean this as an indictment of journalism as a profession. And in sociology, we deal with this stuff all the time. It's what we call kind of an agency structure debate. We have really good individuals and professionals who are put in difficult situations. Now, that doesn't mean that the local TV news anchor is really a good professional, because they're probably just hired because they read well and they know all the proper expressions to use for particular stories, and they play the part of a journalist, right? But journalism is a profession, and journalists still want to do a good job. It just becomes harder and harder for them to do so because of the imperatives of commercial news media. And the ensuing potential effects on democratic institutions, in particular the public's perception of problems or public opinion. Public opinion turns out to be really, really important. If you want policy to change, and politicians aren't sure where the public sort of sits on an issue, maybe right in the middle, undecided this way or that way, you're not likely to get much movement on new policies. And so people who don't want new policies, or who do, they can make investments to push public opinion in one way or another, or to try to hold it steady in that undecided category too. However, in an environment that is increasingly about money and campaign financing, moneyed interests have a definite advantage in terms of influencing public opinion. What happened? So, we have this sort of kind of a causal argument here that leads right back to potentially even more corporate concentration as the system gets captured by a shrinking handful of large and powerful and politically well-connected corporations, potentially capturing not just parts of the campaign election cycle, but also regulatory bodies such as the Federal Communications Commission, Federal Elections Commissions, things like that. I mean, back in the, probably 10, 15 years ago, Colin Powell's son, Michael, who was the head of the FCC, would refer to these large media giants as the clientele of the FCC. It wasn't like he saw his mission as trying to protect the public interest in a diversified media. So, some ideas, they come and they go. And my point on this one is there was this British scientist, John Yudkin, who wrote a book in 1972 called Pure, White, and Deadly about sugar, refined sugar. And he paid a dear price for it, really. His career was destroyed in many ways by a food industry that wasn't ready to see sugar demonized. So his work was brought back, kind of revived, many years later by a professor at, I think, at Cal Berkeley. But, I mean, it must have been very traumatic for him. So he says, can you wonder that sometimes is it worthwhile to do this scientific research on matters of health? Results may be important in helping people to avoid disease, but you find they're being misled by propaganda to support commercial interests. And this is my favorite, in a way you thought only existed in bad B films. Because, I mean, one of the things about propaganda is it doesn't have to be really clever. In fact, the more clever it is, the more people you lose in the process. You keep it simple. Simple messages. The first reference we have to junk food, and junk food news, comes from 1983, and Carl Jensen, who worked for this Project Censored. So that's been around for a while as well. Project Censored is it's a project that tries to look at the stories that get the least amount of coverage and rate them in terms of importance. And one of the chapters they do every year is on what they call junk food news and news abuse. So junk food news is that stuff that really doesn't seem like news at all. It's pretty non-nutritive. News abuse is where you have a story that potentially has some newsworthiness, but the elements that are less newsworthy get traction. So, for instance, Edward Snowden, right? Edward Snowden blows the whistle on the NSA, and the stories we get aren't about what the NSA was doing. The stories we get were about, where's Waldo today? Is he going to be able to go here? Is he going to go there? So it's sort of trivializing what otherwise is a pretty important news story. So, did I skip? I don't know. Hopefully not. Anyway, this is a quote from Noam Chomsky, who essentially says, markets are supposed to be about informed consumers making choices, right? And he says that's not really necessarily what the people who want to control markets want, though. They probably want consumers making irrational choices. And an easy way to think of this is advertising in the advertising industry. Do you really need the new phone? Do you need the BMW to have a good social life, right? We make these choices that are probably irrational, not only on a personal level, but on a societal level in terms of consumption and how many resources we have in the world. But we do the same thing with democracy, right? The point is to get people to make, according to Chomsky, irrational choices that maybe perpetuate the system in place. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Larry Speakes, former spokesperson for Ronald Reagan. And I think it says a lot. And this was back in the 80s, right? So none of this is anything new either. But, don't tell us how to stage the news and we won't tell you how to report it, basically. So the idea being stage news, processing. There's a lot of processing that goes on. So looking at some similarities between news and food, right? Because that's part of the point here. There's some parallels. They both undergo extensive processing. We can talk about junk food and abuse in either one. Outbrain, I've got a few examples that I'll show you later. You've probably seen these things if you get your news online. At the bottom of a page where you're reading an article or something, there's like these little bait images with like 17 people you thought you really liked but are real jerks, whatever they are. I mean, a lot of them are lists, but the idea is we'll provide some bait here and we'll send traffic to another site. And that's the kind of stuff that Outbrain does. And rarely are they real news stories. They're more likely to be sort of junk food, which probably says something about Americans and what they're interested in, right? If you want to really know, go into the supermarket checkout stand and you're not going to find too many, high culture sorts of news magazines right there. In fact, you can barely even find Time magazine in the supermarkets anymore. Concentration of ownership in both the food industry and in media over the last 20, 30 years, and not just in those two. One of the big untold stories is the concentration of corporate ownership of just about every major industry in the United States over that time period. So, if the public is none the wiser, things can sort of continue in that direction. So, public inattention, not necessarily because people are lazy, but the system is pretty well designed. That was the picture at the bottom was from Carl's Jr.'s ad campaign for selling hamburgers, by the way, with Angora sweaters, I guess. Big food and recent history. The food system in some ways has sort of been captured by large corporations. And also parts of it, the regulatory parts that are supposed to keep our food supply safe. Our food supply is probably less safe than it was 20, 30 years ago. Lots of processing, and this is often referred to as flavor engineering in the food industry, especially with fast foods. We have some awareness of the public health effects of these processed foods, increasing rates of diabetes, obesity-related illnesses, heart disease, strokes, high blood pressure, things like that. McDonaldization is a model that has been borrowed from the fast food industry and applied across society, which has four basic principles: efficiency, calculability, which is a focus on quantity over quality of a product, control of workers, control of production processes, and uniformity or predictability. So think about your Disney movie and think about why they all kind of look the same. They last about the same. The subplots are really similar. There are reasons behind that. There's been a lot of processing that goes on. It's not like somebody sat in a room and created a Disney movie from scratch. They started with a template. There are counter trends, obviously. And so, yes, the slow food movement is a real thing. Community support agriculture, CSAs, these are real things that are sort of pushing back against this corporate concentration. Oops. Nice picture of, this was the primary debates when CNN was doing it. Just, you know, it's so clear that the networks are right in there with the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of how the presidential elections take place too. For media, the same kind of thing. I mentioned regulatory capture of media. Political institutions and media, initially, in our society, there was supposed to be this adversarial relationship, right? Media and the press were supposed to hold leaders accountable to the public, but we've gone from adversarial to more advertorial. They seem to be mutually reinforcing more and more. Again, lots of processing of information, and I would contend lots more as the amount of propaganda in the news increases. And we often get an illusion of consensus in this process in a lot of sophisticated ways, but one that's sort of easy to see is if you were to watch all the networks on a given night, you'd see really similar stories. And you might think, well, that means that everybody's in agreement about what the most important stories are, but not necessarily. Everybody may be in agreement about which stories are the least threatening for us to report on and keep our audience at the same time. The 24/7 news cycle really changes everything because we are so saturated with media. So I wanted to give you an example, if I can get this thing to play. This is, some of you will remember this. Maybe. There we go. Oh, no.
You know something?
Just a quick ask.
You know something? If you had told us 1 year ago that we were going to come in third in Iowa, we would have given anything for that. And you know something? You know something? Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina, and Oklahoma, and Arizona, and North Dakota, and New Mexico. We're going to California, and Texas, and New York. We're going to South Dakota, and Oregon, and Washington, and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House.
That was the famous Dean Scream. And okay, he was a little excited, and he definitely knew all the primaries, though, right? He'd memorized those, and I bet he got them in the right order. And but you know, that simple Dean Scream got replayed thousands of times in the first couple of days, and people are all of a sudden, is he insane? Do we want him to have the nuclear launch codes? I mean, the guy screams like that. Is he gonna? I just sent the missiles off to Russia. Yeah, you know. So, you know, just to make that point that yeah. We have a 24/7 news cycle makes a big difference. Again, there are counter trends as well. We have independent news. We have citizen journalism. It's not like people haven't identified these dysfunctions. They're just difficult to address in the current political system and climate. And I'll talk a little about that as well. So, you know, some authors talk about this idea of manufacturing or engineering consent among the population. And back in the 20s, when propaganda was beginning to be developed and elaborated upon, you had people who were really worried after World War I. I mean, are societies just doomed to kill each other off, this mob mentality. How can we distract people from their inherent violent and aggressive tendencies? So it wasn't like we must control the people. Some theorists were more, and Sigmund Freud among them, we have to figure out some way to maintain social order, right? And people were sincere about this. It wasn't just, at the time, a strategy to keep people in line. So, I mean, this is sort of classic here. If we put the right packaging on the proposal, if we give it the right name, the Patriot Act, whatever we call these bills anymore, it makes a difference in selling them. And so some of the effects that you can get are more propaganda content in the news. We get increasing corporate concentration, more propaganda. It's way more sophisticated, and it's opaque, right? You don't know where it's coming from. So there's often talk about the echo chamber, and it's hard to know what the source of news is. And there have been some studies done that suggest that maybe up to half of news stories have their basis in public relations and PR news releases, news wires. Much more seamless integration of all of this, too. So the audience imperative is, you'll hear people say that the audience doesn't matter, it's the advertisers, but the advertisers could care less if there's no audience. So it's really important to have ratings and audience, and you got to have some way to bring them. You got to have some way to provide the proper bait that increases ratings, that interests advertisers in the product. And it's usually not journalistic principles, by the way. So anyway, if this does have sort of a public health effect on democracy, then we can look at the state of news as it is now, dysfunctional as it might be, is one of the symptoms of that. I love this. You can take an image, and some people probably think, oh, Hitler loved children, didn't he? So again, propaganda is for mass persuasion. And it's important, I think, to note that media can produce propaganda, and they do it quite often, and it's part of the strategy for attracting and retaining that audience. But media can also sort of let that propaganda pass through as well, serve as a conduit for propaganda that's produced elsewhere, let's say by a political candidate's consultant. Commercial news and advertising, it's bread and butter, right? If you watch any 30-minute newscast, you're looking at probably 10 to 12 minutes that are advertising. And you're also looking at all the segments in between, that sandwiched in between, that are often teasers to get you ready for what's going to happen after. They're essentially selling you on staying there so that you'll watch the advertising. And then sometimes we do stories that are advertising as well. So you can begin to see how news could be as much as 50% based on PR and propaganda. The idea here is, if we're going to try to understand increasing propaganda content in the news, what does it look like? Because most people that watch the news, they see news stories, right? And one of the principles that's very common is this idea that you distance the propaganda from its source. So you don't want to know where it's coming from necessarily. This happened in the run-up to the Iraq invasion, and afterwards these generals were used to provide a friendly, independent analysis for Donald Rumsfeld and the Department of Defense, without the public really knowing about it. All they knew was these were the independent military analysts. The Pentagon called them message force multipliers. So after this story breaks, Pulitzer Prize-winning story by David Barstow at the New York Times, which lasted, by the way, in the news for a couple of days, no more. So after it breaks, though, they have to do damage control in all the networks who are involved in this, because they hired these generals. They've got to do damage control as well. So here's a scene where Howard Kurtz, who's supposed to be the hard-hitting media analyst is trying to get to the bottom of all this. I should have said that while it was loading. Oh, that worked fast. Okay, here we go.
Are these retired military officials really just puppets of the Pentagon? Howard Kurtz takes a closer look for us.
CNN analyst Don Shepard, a retired general, said he never provided anyone's point of view on his own.
I feel no pressure whatsoever to do anything other than prevent my honest opinions about what's going on.
Okay, so if you're trying to distance the propaganda from its source, now Howard Kurtz should be able to figure that out, right? Who's the last person he would want to interview? The source. I mean, he just did the same thing that media get accused of, is source filtering stories by going straight to Don Shepard, who was lying through his teeth, saying that he was an independent analyst when he was, we have the transcripts from these meetings, and he was simply repeating talking points from the meetings, right? Howard Kurtz has done the same thing, right? He's gone to that source and said, well, is it true? No, it's not true at all. Okay, that's good enough for me. So, I mean, it's pretty pure propaganda as far as that goes. It's distancing the source from the news. Here's another example. If you watch any local news, there's this phenomenon called fake news. And the way it works is corporate client wants to get some story in the news, but doesn't want it presented as a commercial. Right? Would like it presented as a news story. Hires a PR firm, says, well, okay, let's say, Halloween's coming up, can you do some kind of a news story for us? And that's all they need, because they're PRs, pros, and they're good at it, right? So they come up with this story. Usually it's got a consumer testimonial, right? It's got an expert. Got to have an expert in these things. It needs to have an identifiable audience as well. You put these things together, you do it as a news story, you don't attribute it to the corporate client, and you send it out free to local TV stations who can then add their own voiceover. They don't have to pay for it. All they have to do is change the voice. So it's free content for them. But again, it's propaganda, it's public relations. So here's one before it gets the voiceover, because I can't get the better site to operate on this computer. Huey Lewis, we pretty much know if Huey Lewis is in a news story now, we know what generation is being targeted, right? So here he is, and I really lost a lot of respect for him when he did this. But here's what they look like.
The heart of rock and roll is still beating in singer Huey Lewis. Like many baby boomers, his hearing could use a boost.
I noticed it one day on my place in Montana, and I just couldn't hear stuff that I realized I used to be able to hear. So I went and got Jack and shirt up, and fairly significant hearing loss.
1 in every 6 baby boomers have some type of hearing problem. A groundbreaking new hearing device is changing the perception of hearing aids among the baby boomer generation. It's called Delta, developed by Oticon.
This device is designed primarily for light to moderate hearing loss to help them boost speech understanding in various noise conditions.
You got to have a white coat to be an expert. We don't really know if Phil Christensen is a real doctor or audiologist, but he's got a white coat.
And that is the baby boomer.
Delta's innovative design is made possible by placing its receiver or speaker into the ear canal at the end of a thin, transparent sound wire. This unique approach using breakthrough new designs has created a whole new category of hearing solutions called receiver in the ear, or RITE.
By placing the speaker in the ear, we have the absolute best sound quality combined with the cosmetic appeal of the device being actually invisible on the ear.
The first noticeable changes in hearing occur as adults reach their 50s. For those like Huey Lewis who rely on sound, it's much more critical.
I hear everything. I'm a musician, singer, so I got to hear. You can only sing and play as good as you can hear.
For baby boomers like Huey Lewis, a boost in hearing can make a real difference.
Especially in a noisy situation like a restaurant or something like that. It adds because you can hear, you hear a conversation that you can hear before. And it's just easier. I sing a lot less.
On behalf of Oticon, I'm Sandra Martin.
Now, They say there, on behalf of Oticon, oops, I gotta shoot. It's gonna play another. Oh. Sorry, I'm getting there. There we go. They don't generally say this, though, when these things get run on local news. They don't say on behalf of Oticon. These are unattributed. So you're talking about a commercial, essentially, that's being sold as a news story. And the amazing thing is a lot of these are like hard-hitting consumer advocate things, too. So it's supposed to be helping consumers make really good decisions. Back to what Chomsky was saying about markets and irrational consumers and choices. So disambiguation is another pretty common mechanism that's used, a propaganda principle. And maybe you've seen Wikipedia, you know, that sometimes you'll do a search and they'll have like 3 things and they're the same term or person. It's like they disambiguate for you. It's a big word that just means we're gonna make distinctions here. So in terms of disambiguation here, the idea is to create sort of a binary world, right, where people, they're supposed to care about one side or another. And that's easy to understand. You know, we got the ducks and the beavers, right? This particular link there was really about the Anaheim Ducks and something that was said by Emilio Estevez, who was in the Anaheim Ducks movie, right, The Mighty Ducks. And so, I mean, it's not really a news story at all. It's total junk food. But he was saying something about, were they playing Chicago Blackhawks, I think, in the NHL playoffs. And the whole story was nothing but tweets going back and forth. And, you know, this is what news has sort of become, though. And it's easy to get people to care about if they care about one side or the other. And that disambiguation, it's not a natural process. It's definitely one that gets created artificially by really good propagandists. Coke Pepsi I use in my classes a lot to help people understand Republicans and Democrats. So, you know, I mean, if you live in a world where there's only 2 parties that matter, then they can spend a lot of their time and effort marketing themselves and packaging themselves. But if you look at Coke and Pepsi, they're pretty darn similar as a product, right? They're both, well, they got sugar, they got CO2, you know, they've got some caramel coloring. Yeah, maybe one's a little sweeter than the other, but their packaging, their marketing is quite different. And, you know, I would contend that when Republicans and Democrats at the national level, when they get to D.C., if they get elected, they're basically doing whatever the people who gave them large chunks of money asked them to do. They have to win the election, though. They need that audience, just like media need their audiences to interest advertisers. So oftentimes, what happens is elections become kind of like a horse race. If you've ever bet at a horse race, you know how the odds change based on who's betting. And if you don't have people betting on you, and it's a bad sign. It's a bad sign for your candidacy, too, in politics. We don't have time. I'm going to go on here, but this is a nice scene here where Wolf Blitzer's trying to bait Bernie Sanders to talk about Hillary Clinton. And Sanders wants to make a bigger point about wealth inequality. And Blitzer, instead of going with that, because that's not really a popular point, and that's not part of his job there, he keeps bringing him back to, but what about Hillary? What would she say about it? And he keeps saying, well, you have to ask her about that, right? So another thing that propaganda does is these places have audiences, and to the extent that you make them feel good about themselves, you reflect their values and beliefs, they'll stick around. It's called the journalism of affirmation, right? And so we could say that Fox News is a conservative news channel, but to say that it's entirely because of ideological choices would be really going against what I'm trying to say here, is that it's about the money. It's about commercial pressures. So Fox has identified a very conservative audience, and it gives that audience what it wants. And what it would like to believe is that Obama's never done a good thing in his life, right? On the other side, you have MSNBC, who sort of does that on the left-leaning side. But what you get in total is, again, this false binary world where we either care about this one or this one. But when you go to vote for the president, for instance, you see there's more than 2 candidates. There's 13, 14 candidates from different parties. Then you can have narratives, right? Specific kinds of narratives. Here's a little intro that I love, the entitlement nation.
Well, the president's...
Where's my handout, right? I mean, this stuff is, it's just more processing, right? We're getting news, and you know, I need to be fair on that all of the 24/7 cable channels, they've got news and then they have opinion. So you have a little bit of news right here, and then you wrap that around opinion shows because they're cheap. You just have people talking in the studio. You don't have to pay staff to go around the world or anything else. But you know, by the time they get done massaging these issues, you wouldn't recognize them anymore. So we'll take the surfer dude who's on food stamps, and we'll ridicule him on a bunch of opinion shows and conclude that he represents millions of people rather than the success stories and the fact that welfare and food stamps in particular are episodically used. Right? People use them when they need them, and they often prevent them from digging a hole so deep they can never dig their way out or pull their way out of it. Social proof is another really important one because we oftentimes don't make decisions until we think other people have made up their minds as well. So that's where public opinion becomes really important. And one good example of this is global warming and climate change. So if I believe scientists haven't made up their minds about whether it's a real phenomenon and humans are driving it in industrial societies, maybe I'm thinking, well, I'm going to wait and see what the science has to say. And so in that case, the job is, let's keep public opinion here in the undecided category instead of shifting it towards, you know, holy cow, we better do something quick because global warming could be a wave that's breaking over our heads right now. And there are lots of ways to create these illusions of either consensus or uncertainty. If you look at the consensus on global warming, 97% of scientists believe that, it's not believe, contend that it's happening now, and unless action is taken to reduce CO2 atmospheric concentration below 400 back down to about 350 parts per million, that we're looking at some pretty severe changes in the next 50 to 100 years. Okay, I'm going to go through this quick, so if you have questions you can ask. But this is Outbrain down here. That's the kind of stuff you get with Outbrain. This is the idea of bait here. And bait's a little different than propaganda. What sort of stuff it brings that audience, lures that audience out? And these things are pretty basic, and we all kind of understand them. Strange, unusual, celebrity, dramatic elements. I remember watching a CNN story one time, and they were talking about terrorism. But I guess somebody said, go get a file video real quick. And the video they were showing, as they were talking about terrorism, was men praying in a mosque, right? What a horrible connection to make. But I don't think it was done intentionally. Could have been, but I think it was more like, we got to have a visual element here for this story. It's TV. We got to have pictures. Some other kinds of bait. Narratives work well. It's kind of like a story arc. That's what primetime programming does, and it's not a lot different. The sports metaphors, Americans love their competitions, whether it's Republicans and Democrats, or it's Fox and CNN, or it's the Yankees and the Red Sox, or the Beavers and the Ducks. You name it, we love to pick sides on that stuff and watch, and there's no other way you can get people to care about a presidential election that's still, 18 months away. But people will be looking at poll results 18 months before the election as if they mean anything. A lot more audience participation these days, too. And that's not really news, but people like to feel like they're being heard. I got some more stuff here. I'm just going to lay this out. There are serious potential public health issues because of this increasing propaganda in the news. Part of it has to do with capturing of elections, really, through money, through large organizations, the national parties, industries. Public perceptions in society get skewed over time. I mentioned global warming. The whole idea, if you can convince people, for instance, that democracy is the same as elections, if we hold elections, therefore we have democracy, then that sort of takes the pressure off of them to do due diligence in terms of making sure that all the ideas are out there on the table, rather than here's the Republicans, here's the Democrats, let's let the horse race continue. In terms of spending in campaigns as a percent of GDP, interesting, 1896, right, was really high. There was a consensus that nobody wanted William Jennings Bryan, who was the anti-business candidate. Otherwise, you see a marked increase in the last 4 elections. So now with Citizens United, this new ruling where corporations are people and we don't want to hurt their free speech rights, we're getting a whole lot more money that we don't even know where it's coming from. So same thing with news. Now it's money. In fact, the chair of the Federal Elections Commission has said she's not even going to try to enforce the election laws in this round. They're just too complicated. There's too much gridlock on the FEC itself. And she's going to spend her time instead at least trying to bring up the dysfunction of the institution. And all that money, think about who benefits from it, right? If the money in elections is doubling, tripling, quadrupling, media get a good chunk of that money through more airtime, through ads purchased, that sort of thing, campaign ads. So where's the incentive there to make changes? I'm just going to stop because I could keep going, but if people have questions, I'd like to respond.
Questions?
It's not really a question, it's just more of a comment. I was thinking of the analogies you were making between fast food and the media, and I thought, one thing that they've done with food that's kind of useful is recognizing that sometimes too much of a good thing is bad for you. They've got all these labeling, so they've got the number of calories from fat. It might be interesting if they could do something similar with the propaganda content in media to make it clear what we were ingesting.
Yeah, I think, and that is, for any of this to be useful, you have to really know if things are changing over time, and the only way to know is to be able to measure. Is the the fat, the sugar, the salt, are those things in our news diet increasing? So yeah, that's one of the big challenges. How do you measure propaganda content?
I also want to comment a little bit, and I want to mention something that I'm curious that the information about healthy food has been censored in our news media. And, I heard that in Texas there's a law, a statute law, basically asks the news media to not discuss the dangerous thing about food. Any news story, if you talk about the dangerous side of the food, you will be punished. I want to
Well,
make
I
this.
don't see. I'm not sure that would require any sort of decree, because anybody who wants that advertising revenue. I mean, you take a company like PepsiCo alone has probably $1.5 billion advertising budget. Who can say no to that, right? So they'll all know quickly. Well, you don't want to advertise in this outlet because they're being hard on our products.
Opera actually has been sued by Texas, the beef industry, because she mentioned that the mad cow disease is a problem, and Texas Beef Industries Association quickly launched a lawsuit against her.
They've got the money, So, from their point of view, if it's not illegal, it's good business, right? In some ways, and if you're invested in that, you may not even know it, but part of your 401k might be invested in that, and it's like, oh, I don't care what's going on, but I sure like the returns I'm getting on this. Yeah, I mean, those are valid points. Yeah, I agree with you. Scott?
Hey, Bill. One of the things I see here is kind of this dynamic where you have the news as a public good versus news as a private good. I don't know in your research if you really looked at the difference, because I know the FCC treats cable news differently from CBS, PBS, and, well, obviously PBS, but CBS, NBC, and the major networks. I know the rules are different, the rules of the game. Did you look at all at how that plays into kind of your thesis that things are homogenizing and moving in that direction, and are they moving more? I think it's obvious that they're moving more rapidly, but is there any sort of metric we could see that the difference between the way news has evolved in that quasi-public sphere versus the pure private cable news sphere?
Well, I think, the FCC really in many ways hasn't done its job, but it's harder for the networks, the traditional networks, to move as quickly just because they have so much less news. I mean, if you have sort of an MSNBC and an NBC that are, joined at the hip, that's a little bit different. But the cable networks have a lot more opportunity to insert propaganda than, not to say that, say, an NBC or CBS doesn't do that, though.
So I'm just thinking back to when Dan Rather was essentially fired, right?
Yeah.
He basically had a story that he couldn't.
George Bush's.
He was the
Air National
Guard
yeah.
situation, but he wasn't able to reveal his source. Now you can get away with doing that in the cable news world, and you can't do that in the network news world, and to me that's kind of an interesting. So the different rules allow for this kind of homogenization of the news.
Well, I don't think he was necessarily fired, though, because CBS violated a rule so much as the pressure on CBS to appear with a Republican administration to be liberally biased there was a perception problem, too. So he was resigned in some ways. Now, you've got a good point, and no, I can't say that I've really looked at those differences, yeah.
Any other questions for Bill?
How do you project correcting media corruption in our society?
Well, I think hopefully the public health has some insights to provide on that, but I think money clearly is an issue too, right? Money in politics, and that money corrupts the media process as well, because they benefit so much from all the increased money in terms of campaign ads and airtime and that sort of thing. So I think it would be really hard with campaign financing laws and the Citizens United ruling the way it stands right now for media to say, we can't really take that money, sorry. But one thing we have disinvested in is public media too. So if you look like at the UK, the BBC provides, I think, a higher quality product. If you look at PBS and you look at people who listen to NPR or watch PBS, they're much less likely to be misinformed than people who are watching. Now the commercial networks, the CBS, ABC, they're in the middle. Cable are the worst. All three of them, MSNBC, Fox, CNN, are the worst in terms of people believing things that are just factually untrue. Public is the best. BBC, although they may have a harder time covering their own government because they know where the money comes from, right? More investment in public media, I think, would be another essential element to that. It takes at least part of that advertising equation out of it and the pressure that advertisers can bring to bear.
Sorry, when you were saying that the cable networks are the worst in terms of people who listen to those cable networks having the wrong idea, is that like a study or something that's shown that? Like
Yeah, like there's a Fairleigh Dickinson study, the Pew does studies on these. It's pretty clear, in fact, in terms of Fox News, people who reported anyway, not watching any news, were less likely to be misinformed on issues than people who were exclusively watching Fox, the network. Yeah, there have been a few studies done, and I think it's sort of like food. You don't want to make any decisions based on a couple of studies, right? You need to kind of look at this stuff because we've made mistakes with the food industry as well in terms of what's good for you, what's not. But one thing we know, and one thing that seems to be a constant, is the processing. The more processing, the worse it is for you, whether it's food or whether it's news and information.
Very good. Well, we're at 5 o'clock hour. I think if you have additional questions for Bill, I'm sure he'd stay around and answer them. This brings our colloquium series to an end for the year, so thank you very much, and thank you, Bill, for interesting talk.
Thank you.